Hello and welcome to Theology Matters. This is Dr. John Clark, and today we want to continue our study on false gospel response cliches. In the last couple of weeks, we looked at the false response cliche of requiring a sinner's prayer in order for somebody to be saved. And today we want to look at one of the most popular, if not the most popular, cliche in our modern church culture, especially with children, and that is asking Jesus into your heart. In fact, one pastor estimated that he had asked Jesus into his heart 600 plus times as a child growing up, and that's just factoring in 6 to 18 years old, at least 50 weeks out of the year, responding to an altar call and or being led in a sinner's prayer. And for many of our listeners, if I was to even ask the question by a show of hands, how many of the listeners have asked Jesus into their heart? I would venture to say that close to 100% or 90% of the hands would shoot up in the air. And ironically, as I've done that in the past in group settings, I've asked a second question, and that is simply this. If you have asked Jesus in your heart, leave your hand in the air. And if you've asked him into your heart more than once, keep your hand up. And the majority of the people keep their hand up. And I, in one group in particular, said, what about more than 5 times? Leave your hand up. More than 10 times, leave your hand up. And as you can imagine, the hands stay up in the air. And that's what's ironic about this false gospel cliche, because it's really taken hold in our culture, especially in children's ministry. In fact, when you think about Awana, which was a ministry founded by men who valued gospel clarity and who valued that the single biblical response of faith alone and the finished work of Christ alone, there was a recent Awana statistic where they gave a gospel accuracy survey to some 18,000 pastors and Christian workers. And out of the 18,000, 13,500 of them stated that they agreed with the gospel invitation about asking Jesus to come into your heart. That's over 75% of those who are involved in the Awana ministry that took this particular survey and were involved in this statistic. And so you can see that it's prevalent even in ministries designed for children that had a baseline or a foundation of being clear on the gospel. At the outset, I want to just express my gratitude to Pastor Dennis Roxer with the Duluth Bible Church. And if you have not gotten a copy of his booklet called 7 Reasons Not to Ask Jesus into Your Heart, it's published by Grace Gospel Press. I would highly recommend it. And in those 7 reasons, I just wanted to read those at the outset. Pastor Roxer says this: number 1, don't ask Jesus into your heart because it is never found in the Bible. Number 2, don't ask Jesus into your heart because it is not how one is saved. Number 3, don't ask Jesus into your heart because it requires no understanding of the gospel of grace to do it. Number 4, don't ask Jesus into your heart because it confuses the means of salvation with the results of salvation. Number 5, don't ask Jesus into your heart because it either results in no assurance of salvation or brings a false assurance to people. Number 6, don't ask Jesus into your heart because Revelation 3:20 does not teach it. And number 7, don't ask Jesus into your heart because it does not clarify the condition of salvation. It confuses it, especially with children. And so that booklet is going to be a tool and a resource that I use throughout this series of studies on this false cliche, asking Jesus in your heart. But before we get into that, I wanted to provide a background, just as a helpful understanding of where this cliche may have originated and come from. In fact, it turns out that the Anglo-American Puritans and evangelicals in the 17th and 18th centuries used the phrase "receive Christ into your heart" or something akin to that with some regularity. And some examples of that is the great Puritan devotional writer John Flavel, for example, spoke of those who had heard the gospel but who would receive not Christ into their hearts. And that was his way of explaining that they had not responded to the gospel. But he used this phrase. And it was just as common for pastors of that area to use the phrase as well to describe a Christian act of devotion. Thomas Boston, who lived from 1676 to 1732, he was a Scottish Calvinist pastor, encouraged Christians taking communion to receive Christ into their hearts. Another pastor by the name of Benjamin Coleman, around the same time frame, who was actually the leading evangelical pastor in Boston during that time in the early 18th century, wrote explicitly that Christians should receive Christ into their hearts and hold him forth in their lives. Now, the terminology of receiving Christ into your heart became more formalized as a non-Christian's prayer of conversion during the great missionary movement of the 19th century. And so for those using the terminology, it became a useful way to explain to any kind of proselyte that they needed to make a personal decision to follow Christ. William Carey is associated with using this phrase or a variation of it to invite people to make a personal decision. And then Eliza Hawes, who was connected to the early Vacation Bible School movement, seemed to utilize and make popular this phrase in the 1900s as a favorite way to explain salvation in children's ministry. And in fact, she may be considered the godmother, so to speak, of this phrase in terms of making it mainstream and mainline, because her focus, again, was in children's ministry, and she felt that this explanation helped the kids understand salvation, that it made it a little bit more understandable for children. But it gets us all the way to the 1970s, where we see a major uptick in the use of the actual phrase, which we're familiar with, asking Jesus into your heart. And it's probably due to the fact that many children's ministries during the 70s became more formalized, and leaders constantly looked for simple ways to explain to children what a decision for Christ would entail. Now, why do people use it? Well, some use this phrase and claim that this response simplifies the gospel, or simplifies the response to the gospel, especially for children. The concept of faith explained biblically is something that even children could not understand. That's their reasoning, that this concept of faith is too abstract, and they needed to give them something more concrete so that they could sink their teeth into what exactly it meant to put their faith in Christ. And in fact, when we look at a sermon given to children in 1845 by a man named Alexander Fletcher, we get the transcript. It says this: "Oh, my young friends, how happy you shall be when Christ enters into your heart. I should like every little child this afternoon to present the following beautiful petition to Christ. It is a very remarkable one, but oh, he loves it. It is this: O Jesus, enter my heart. May thy grace enter into the soul of a little child, there to dwell forever." Now, concerned about the prevalence of false conversions, many pastors were keen to emphasize that salvation is not something attained just by attending church or being born in a Christian home. They wanted to emphasize that salvation is personal and individual, that every sinner has to respond to Jesus Christ and the gospel for themselves. And thus they began to use this phrase, asking Jesus into your heart or receiving him into your heart, as a ways to solidify that decision. But the irony of the situation is this: although the phrase might have been used to prevent false conversions, its misuse can in fact heighten the problem of false conversions, as we'll look at when we get into our study a little bit more. Now, one of the other things to consider is why is the cliche so prevalent? And I think I have alluded to it, but mainly we can trace its popularity to the formalized children's ministry teaching materials that have been developed over time. And, just on a personal level, as I've analyzed hundreds, if not thousands, of formal written gospel presentations over the years, many of them, ironically, do not include asking Jesus into your heart in the formal literature, when you look at formal literature. However, what is included in the literature is almost 100% of the time is a version of the sinner's prayer. And we looked at that in our last 4 sessions, but I believe that the sinner's prayer is the link to the verbal exhortation to asking Jesus into one's heart. This is typically a part of the prayer, or part of the wording that people use in order to lead people into prayer. It's kind of like the sermon I mentioned earlier from Alexander Fletcher. It was something simple, but, "Oh, Jesus, enter my heart." And so it just kind of became formalized in terms of the phrase itself. Now, this is the case in much of Lifeway's Vacation Bible School material. It includes a sinner's prayer without the exact wording of asking Jesus into one's heart, but much of the informal verbal presentation of the material by volunteers includes a form of asking Jesus into their hearts. This is also the case in Cru's material, formerly Campus Crusade for Christ. Again, they contain a sinner's prayer without the official phrase, "Ask Jesus into your heart." However, they too have a follow-up button on their website with the wording, "Yes, I ask Jesus into my life." And so you can see that is a variety of asking Jesus into their heart. And as I mentioned earlier, even though Awana strives hard to keep the gospel clear in its materials, many Awana programs around the country, through their volunteers, communicate that children must ask Jesus into their hearts to be saved. In fact, one night there's a story of a certain church where a girl was found in one corner of the room, standing and looking up at the ceiling towards the sky with her mouth wide open. And one of the leaders questioned her about her action, and the girl replied, "I am waiting for Jesus to come into my heart." And I even have a personal story with one of my sons who was involved in an Awana ministry at a church in our community. And one of his Awana teachers, well-meaning and sincere, asked my son if he had ever asked Jesus into his heart. One day after class, as I was waiting to pick him up, he had asked my son, "Have you ever asked Jesus into your heart?" And my son told him, "No, my dad's told me never to do that," which you can imagine the response from the Awana worker, And so many people believe that you have to ask Jesus in your heart to be saved. And so it's safe to assume that this phrasing is shared millions of times per year in our country through different vacation Bible school programs, Christian summer camps, Sunday schools, youth retreats, and Sunday morning services. And it begs the question, why does it even matter? Well, that's what we're going to look at in the next section. We're going to look at some of the common objections as to why this phraseology does matter, and why asking Jesus into your heart is not the proper biblical response to the gospel. I hope you'll join us next time.